In the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged over the English Channel, a captured Spitfire touched down at Rechlin, Nazi Germany's most secretive aircraft testing facility. What happened next would challenge everything the Luftwaffe believed about air superiority. Major Werner Melders, Germany's leading fighter ace, climbed into the cockpit of the enemy's most feared weapon and discovered truths that would be whispered in hangars, but never publicly acknowledged. When later Spitfire variants fell into German hands, test pilots confronted an uncomfortable reality. No German fighter could match the performance they measured. This is the story of the men who flew both sides of the war. The 444 miles per hour that exposed the gap between propaganda and physics. And the secret reports that told a story Germany's leadership refused to hear. Want to discover the untold stories from inside the Third Reich's most classified aviation programs? Hit that subscribe button now. The story you're about to hear is documented in German test reports, Allied intelligence assessments, and the first-hand accounts of pilots who survived to tell what they learned. This is history without the propaganda, based on the cold numbers that couldn't be argued away. The May morning in 1940 when Spitfire MKEAX 4260 of No. 603 Squadron crash-landed south of Calais changed more than just one British pilot's war. Pilot officer Bill Keister had been covering the evacuation from Dunkirk when his aircraft sustained battle damage during a dogfight with Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine began losing power, forcing Keister to put the fighter down in occupied territory. German troops reached the aircraft before Keister could destroy it, finding the Spitfire largely intact despite the forced landing. Within days, the captured fighter was on a transport to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's central testing facility located about 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin. Rechlin was not just another airfield. It was the Reich's most important aviation research center, a sprawling complex where every captured Allied aircraft eventually arrived for evaluation. The facility operated 3 separate airfields connected by a hexagonal perimeter road, with hangars housing everything from experimental jet prototypes to captured enemy fighters. Here, Germany's best test pilots flew aircraft wearing Luftwaffe markings that had been built in Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. The intelligence gathered at Rechlin informed tactical doctrine, influenced aircraft design priorities, and occasionally revealed uncomfortable truths about German aviation that contradicted official narratives. The Spitfire's arrival at Rechlin in late May 1940 generated considerable interest among Luftwaffe leadership. By this point in the war, German pilots had encountered Spitfires over France and the Channel, and their reports were concerning. The Spitfire appeared to match or exceed the Bf-109E's performance in many flight regimes, particularly in sustained turning combat where the British fighter demonstrated clear superiority. But combat reports were subjective, colored by adrenaline and survival instinct, often contradictory. What Rechlin offered was objective measurement, systematic testing under controlled conditions that would reveal exactly what the Spitfire could do, and more importantly, what German fighters might struggle to counter. Major Werner Mulders was the obvious choice to conduct the initial evaluation flights. At 27 years old, Mulders was already Germany's most celebrated fighter ace, having shot down 14 aircraft during the Spanish Civil War and added another 25 victories during the campaigns in Poland and France. He understood air combat not just as a pilot but as a tactician, someone who could analyze an opponent's aircraft for exploitable weaknesses. His reputation meant his assessments carried weight with Luftwaffe high command, and his combat experience ensured he would recognize tactically significant characteristics that pure test pilots might miss. Melders approached the captured Spitfire with professional curiosity mixed with caution. The fighter sat in a Rechlin hangar, its RAF roundels now partially covered with Luftwaffe crosses, looking sleek and purposeful, even at rest. The elliptical wings that would become iconic were immediately striking, giving the aircraft a graceful appearance that contrasted with the more angular lines of German fighters. Mulders walked around the Spitfire slowly, examining its construction, noting the quality of the riveting and the finish of the paintwork. Everything about the fighter suggested careful manufacture and attention to detail, characteristics he associated with British engineering. The pre-flight inspection revealed several interesting features. The Spitfire's controls were light and responsive even on the ground, requiring less force than the Bf-109's heavier systems. The cockpit was more spacious than the cramped confines of German fighters, with better visibility in most directions thanks to the rounded canopy design. The instrument panel was logically laid out, though labeled in English, and Mulders spent time with translators ensuring he understood every gauge and control before attempting flight. One immediate observation: the Spitfire's propeller was a 2-position design, offering only takeoff and cruise settings rather than the continuous variability of German constant-speed propellers. This would prove significant. The first flight took place on a clear morning in early June 1940, with Mulders running through the checklist carefully despite pressure from observers eager for his assessment. The Merlin engine started smoothly, settling into a steady rumble that lacked the harsh mechanical noise of the Daimler-Benz inline engines Mulders knew intimately. Taxiing revealed excellent ground handling, the Spitfire's wide-track landing gear providing stable, predictable behavior that made the Bf-109's narrow gear seem primitive by comparison. German fighters were notorious for ground handling accidents, their landing gear geometry making takeoffs and landings unnecessarily dangerous, particularly for inexperienced pilots. The Spitfire had no such vice. The takeoff was almost absurdly easy. Mulders advanced the throttle smoothly and the Spitfire accelerated quickly, lifting off after a short ground run with minimal tendency to swing or torque roll. This was remarkable. The Bf-109E required constant rudder correction during takeoff to counter the engine's torque, and inattentive pilots often found themselves careening off the runway. The Spitfire simply flew straight, as though it had been designed by engineers who understood that fighters needed to be flown by pilots of varying skill levels, not just experts. Mulders climbed to altitude, thinking about the thousands of young Luftwaffe pilots who would benefit from such forgiving handling characteristics. At 10,000 feet, Mulders began systematic testing. First, basic handling: rolls, turns, climbs, dives, examining how the Spitfire responded across its flight envelope. The controls remained beautifully harmonized at all speeds, light and responsive without being twitchy or oversensitive. Roll rate was excellent, better than the Bf-109E, particularly at high speeds where German fighters developed heavy aileron forces. The Spitfire's ailerons worked wonderfully throughout the speed range, allowing crisp rolling maneuvers that tactical doctrine emphasized. Mulders rolled the Spitfire left and right repeatedly, marveling at how easily the aircraft responded, how predictable its behavior remained. Then came turning tests, and here the Spitfire revealed its greatest strength. Mulders pulled the fighter into a hard turn, feeling the G-forces build as the airframe tightened the radius. The Spitfire turned and turned and turned, carving circles in the sky with a tightness that no Bf-109 could match. The elliptical wings generated tremendous lift with minimal drag, allowing sustained high G-turns that would have forced a Messerschmitt to either reduce angle of attack or lose altitude. This was a revelation. German tactical doctrine emphasized energy fighting, diving attacks that used superior altitude to build speed because the Bf-109 could not compete in sustained turning combat. The Spitfire made sustained turning combat viable, giving British pilots a tactic that negated German advantages. Speed testing came next, and here the results were more complex. At low altitude below 10,000 feet, the Bf-109E held a small speed advantage, perhaps 10 miles per hour depending on specific conditions. But as altitude increased, the Spitfire began to close that gap. At 15,000 feet, the two fighters were essentially equal in level flight speed. Above 20,000 feet, the Spitfire might actually be marginally faster, though the difference was within measurement error. Neither aircraft had overwhelming speed superiority over the other, which meant German pilots could not rely on simply running away from Spitfires the way they could from older British fighters like the Hurricane. Climb rate testing produced similar results. The Bf-109E climbed slightly better at low altitude, but again the margin was small and decreased as altitude increased. Above 20,000 feet, the Spitfire actually outclimbed the Messerschmitt, its Merlin engine developing better power at altitude than the Daimler-Benz. This was tactically significant. German doctrine called for maintaining altitude advantage, using height to dictate engagement terms. If Spitfires could climb as well as Bf-109s, that altitude advantage became harder to maintain, requiring German pilots to start higher or risk being caught level or even below their opponents. Then Mulders discovered the Spitfire's critical weakness, the characteristic that would color his entire assessment. During aggressive maneuvering that involved negative G flight, pushing the nose down hard while inverted, or during certain attack geometries, the Merlin engine cut out completely. The float-type carburetor that fed fuel to the engine relied on gravity, and negative G conditions caused the fuel to lift away from the intake, starving the engine instantly. The engine would restart once positive G conditions returned, but those seconds of power loss could be fatal in combat. A German pilot being pursued by a Spitfire could push forward hard on the stick, diving away under negative G, and the British fighter would lose power, unable to follow effectively. This weakness was real and tactically exploitable, but Mulders recognized it was also correctable. The problem was not fundamental to the Spitfire's design, but rather a characteristic of its fuel system, something that could be engineered around with different carburetor designs. German Daimler-Benz engines used fuel injection that functioned regardless of G loading, a more sophisticated system that the British apparently had not yet implemented. But surely they would, once enough combat experience revealed the limitation. This was a temporary advantage, not a permanent one, and Melders knew that tactical doctrine built around exploiting temporary advantages would eventually fail once those advantages disappeared. The two-position propeller was another limitation, less dramatic than the fuel cutout but operationally significant. In combat, engine power needed to match tactical requirements constantly, full power for climbing or accelerating, moderate power for cruising, specific settings for different attack profiles. The German constant-speed propeller adjusted automatically, maintaining optimal blade angle for whatever the pilot demanded. The Spitfire's two-position design meant the pilot had to manually select between takeoff and cruise settings, and neither was optimal for all the speed ranges encountered in combat. The engine was either overspeeding at low speeds or underutilized at high speeds, unable to deliver its full potential across the flight envelope. But again, Mulders recognized this as a correctable deficiency rather than a fundamental flaw. Constant speed propellers were not mysterious technology unavailable to Britain. They existed, they worked, and surely the RAF would adopt them once the limitations of two-position propellers became clear. The Spitfire Mulders was flying represented British fighter technology of 1939, now somewhat obsolete in 1940, and he had to evaluate not just the current aircraft but what improved versions might become. After landing, Melders composed his official report for Luftwaffe High Command. The document, dated June 1940, would become controversial in later years for its seemingly harsh assessment of the Spitfire as miserable as a fighting aircraft. But context mattered. Melders was evaluating the Spitfire against German tactical doctrine that emphasized diving attacks and boom and zoom energy fighting. For those tactics, the negative G fuel cutout and propeller limitations were serious handicaps that justified the miserable characterization. The Spitfire's superior turning ability, better handling qualities, and comparable performance in most flight regimes received less emphasis because German tactics did not depend on sustained turning combat. The report's language reflected Mulders' operational perspective. He acknowledged the Spitfire handled wonderfully, turned beautifully, and matched the Bf-109's performance in most respects. But he emphasized the fuel cutout weakness and propeller limitations because these represented exploitable vulnerabilities that German pilots needed to understand and use tactically. The report was meant for fighter pilots, not historians, and it prioritized actionable intelligence over balanced academic assessment. Mulders was telling his fellow pilots how to beat the Spitfire, not writing an objective comparison for posterity. And what the report did not say, but what Mulders certainly understood, was how good the Spitfire was despite its limitations. A British fighter from 1939 matched Germany's latest and best fighter in 1940 across most performance metrics. The Spitfire had been designed earlier, using less powerful engines and presumably with fewer resources, yet it competed effectively with the Bf-109E. This suggested that improved Spitfire versions with more powerful engines, better fuel systems, and constant speed propellers would exceed German fighter performance. The gap was not closing. It was opening, and Melders had just flown evidence of Britain's latent superiority in fighter design. The Battle of Britain that unfolded over the summer of 1940 confirmed Mulders' test flight conclusions while also revealing their limitations. German pilots who followed the tactical guidance, using diving attacks and avoiding sustained turning combat, could fight Spitfires effectively. But the negative G escape tactic worked only if the German pilot recognized the threat early enough to use it. Spitfires bouncing Bf-109s from above often achieved kills before German pilots could dive away under negative G. The tactic required discipline and situational awareness, qualities not universal among all Luftwaffe pilots, particularly less experienced ones who made up increasing percentages of fighter units as casualties mounted. More significantly, British pilots adapted. They learned to recognize the diving escape and adjusted their tactics, positioning themselves to cut off escape routes or attacking in ways that made diving away difficult. The Spitfire's superior turning ability became more important as RAF pilots exploited it more effectively, forcing engagements into turning battles where German energy tactics could not be applied. And as Melders had predicted, improved Spitfire versions began appearing. The constant speed propeller arrived by late summer 1940, eliminating that weakness. Higher-grade fuel allowed increased engine boost, raising performance across the board. By September 1940, when Mulders shot down his 40th aircraft and received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross, he knew the Spitfire situation was evolving unfavorably. The British fighter kept improving while the Bf-109E remained essentially unchanged. New Spitfire Mk2 versions with more powerful Merlin engines appeared in squadron service, slightly faster and better climbing than the Mki. These improvements were incremental but cumulative, each one narrowing the already thin performance margins German pilots depended on. The Battle of Britain was being lost not just because Germany lacked bombers with sufficient range or because Luftwaffe leadership made strategic errors, but because British fighters were getting better while German fighters stayed the same. The introduction of the Focke-Wulf FW-190 in late 1941 temporarily restored German fighter superiority over the Channel front. The new radial engine fighter was faster, rolled better, and outclimbed the Spitfire MKV that had become the Aero V standard fighter. For nearly a year, the FW-190 dominated, achieving kill ratios that recalled the early war period when German fighters had held clear advantages. But the British responded with improved Spitfire versions that closed the gap again, including the MKIX with its two-stage supercharged Merlin engine, delivering substantially more power at altitude. When Spitfire MKVBE N8304 landed on the occupied Channel Island of Jersey in November 1942, the Germans gained access to a much more developed version of the fighter Melders had tested 2 years earlier. Pilot Officer Bernard Scheidhauer had gotten lost in bad weather during a mission and accidentally landed at the German-held airfield, realizing his mistake too late. The captured Spitfire was in excellent condition, requiring only minor repairs before transport to Rechlin for evaluation. This was a prize, giving German test pilots access to the Spitfire variant that was currently fighting FW-190s over France. But at Rechlin, someone had a more creative idea. Rather than simply evaluate the captured Spitfire as is, why not install a German engine and see what happened? The proposal was both clever and somewhat bizarre. Combining the Spitfire's excellent airframe with the Daimler-Benz DB605A engine that powered the latest Bf-109G fighters. This engine produced about 2,000 horsepower, substantially more than the Spitfire's Merlin, and used fuel injection that eliminated the negative G cutout problem. The resulting hybrid would be neither Spitfire nor Messerschmitt, but something unprecedented. A test of what the Spitfire's airframe could do with superior powerplant technology. The conversion work took months, requiring complete redesign of engine mounts, cooling systems, and associated plumbing. The Daimler-Benz engine was heavier than the Merlin, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity and requiring ballast adjustments to maintain proper balance. The propeller and carburetor air scoop came from a Bf-109G, giving the hybrid Spitfire a distinctly German appearance at the front end while retaining the elliptical wings and rounded fuselage that identified it as British. The electrical system was completely replaced, converting from Britain's 12-volt standard to Germany's 24-volt standard so that German instruments and equipment would function properly. The hybrid aircraft, unofficially dubbed Messerschmitt by some engineers, was ready for flight testing by mid-1943. Test pilot Gerhard Ellenreeder climbed into the cockpit for the first flight from Daimler-Benz's facility at Echterdingen, near Stuttgart. His report, filed after several test flights, documented remarkable performance. The DB605A engine's extra power transformed the Spitfire's already excellent performance into something extraordinary. Top speed increased by about 30 miles per hour compared to the standard MKVB. Climb rate improved dramatically, the hybrid reaching 70 feet per second sustained climb. Substantially better than either the standard Spitfire or the Bf-109G. Service ceiling increased to over 41,000 feet, several thousand feet higher than the standard Spitfire MKV could reach. Most significantly, Ellenreeder noted the hybrid handled beautifully. The Spitfire's inherently good flying qualities remained intact, the airframe accepting the more powerful German engine without developing vicious characteristics. Ground handling was still superior to the Bf-109, takeoffs and landings remained easy, and the wide-track landing gear eliminated the ground accident problems that plagued German fighters. In the air, the controls stayed light and responsive, the superior wing area providing better maneuverability than German fighters could manage. The hybrid demonstrated conclusively that the Spitfire's airframe design was fundamentally excellent, limited only by the power available from its engine. This should have been good news for Germany, evidence that superior German engine technology could compensate for British airframe advantages. But the test revealed an uncomfortable implication. British engine technology was the limiting factor in Spitfire performance, not airframe design or aerodynamics. If British engineers developed more powerful engines approaching the DB605's output, which they inevitably would, the resulting Spitfire would substantially outperform existing German fighters. The Messerschmitt proved that the Spitfire's potential exceeded what current versions demonstrated, and that potential would be realized once better engines became available, and British engines were improving. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was already in its 60th variant by 1943. With two-stage supercharging, water methanol injection, and other refinements that dramatically increased power output at altitude. The Merlin 60 series engines produced over 1,600 horsepower, approaching the DB605's output, and when installed in Spitfire airframes created the MKX variant that matched or exceeded FW-190 performance. Later Merlin versions would push 2,000 horsepower, and Rolls-Royce was developing the even more powerful Griffon engine that would ultimately produce over 2,000 horsepower in operational versions. The Spitfire MKIX began appearing over France in mid-1942, and German pilots immediately recognized it as a significant threat. The MKX was faster than the FW-190 at medium and high altitudes, climbed better above 20,000 feet, and retained the Spitfire's superior turning ability at all altitudes. The FW-190's advantages at low altitude remained, but German fighters no longer held overwhelming superiority at any flight regime. British pilots flying MKIXs could engage or disengage at will, choosing to fight when tactical conditions favored them and refusing combat otherwise. This was exactly the situation German pilots had enjoyed earlier in the war, and the reversal was not welcome. Worse, intelligence reports indicated even more capable Spitfire versions were in development. The Mk14 with its Rolls-Royce Griffon engine would represent another substantial performance increase, with speed approaching 440 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. 440 miles per hour. No production German fighter could match that speed. The FW-190D, still in development in 1943, might reach 425 miles per hour at best altitude with the Jumo 213 inline engine. The Bf-109G, even with the DB-605 engine, topped out around 400 miles per hour. The gap was opening again, and this time Germany lacked the industrial capacity to close it. The numbers were damning. A Spitfire Mk14 could fly at 440 miles per hour at 20,500 feet. This was not estimate or projection, but measured performance from test flights of early production aircraft. The Bf-109G6, Germany's most numerous fighter in 1944, achieved 400 miles per hour at 23,000 feet. The FW-190A8 managed 408 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Neither German fighter could catch a Spitfire Mk14 in level flight at any altitude. If a Mk14 pilot chose to run, German pilots could not pursue. The tactical implications were profound and entirely negative for Germany. Climb rate told the same story. The Spitfire Mk14 climbed at 4,580 feet per minute, substantially better than either German fighter. It reached 20,000 feet almost 2 minutes faster than a Bf-109G. A lifetime in combat where altitude advantage determined who controlled the engagement. The Mk14 could take off later, climb faster, arrive at combat altitude with advantage, fight or not as its pilot chose, and disengage at will if things turned unfavorable. This was not merely superior performance. It was combat dominance encoded in physics. These numbers existed in German intelligence reports, compiled from interrogations of captured British pilots, analysis of downed Spitfire MKXIVs, and the occasional test flight when a Mk14 force landed in territory German forces could reach before its destruction. The reports circulated among Luftwaffe technical staff and made their way to fighter unit commanders, who needed to understand what their pilots would face. But the numbers did not circulate widely in public, did not appear in propaganda, and certainly were not acknowledged by leadership in ways that might suggest German fighter superiority was evaporating. The response to these revelations was not to accelerate development of competitive German fighters, but rather to increase production of existing types while blaming pilot quality degradation for worsening combat results. This was partially true. German pilot training had been drastically shortened to replace mounting losses, and late-war Luftwaffe fighter pilots often had less than 100 hours of flight time before entering combat. But even expert German pilots in optimal aircraft could not overcome the performance gap that had opened. A superbly flown Bf-109G fighting a competently flown Spitfire Mk14 faced mathematical disadvantages that skill could not fully overcome. Test pilot opinions reinforced what the numbers showed. German pilots who flew captured late-war Spitfires uniformly praised the aircraft's qualities. The handling remained superb across all versions. The visibility was excellent. The controls were beautifully harmonized. The aircraft forgave pilot errors that would kill someone in a Bf-109, and most damning of all, the performance was simply better. Faster, higher climbing, longer ranged, carrying heavier armament, and doing it all with less complexity and easier maintenance than German fighters required. The Spitfire was not just marginally superior. It was comprehensively better across nearly every metric that mattered in air combat. Günther Rall, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 275 victories, test flew captured versions of practically all top Allied fighters during the war. His assessment was blunt. He preferred the Spitfire, not as a novelty or curiosity, but as the fighter he would choose if forced to select among all available options. Coming from a pilot who had achieved his success exclusively in Bf-109s, this was remarkable testimony. Raoul understood the Bf-109's strengths and had exploited them masterfully, but he also recognized its limitations and knew the Spitfire had fewer of them. Heinz Bauer, another high-scoring German ace with 220 victories, acknowledged that Spitfire shot him down at least once and forced him to make 6 emergency landings after combat damage. His comment was telling. Of course, the quality of the Spitfire needs no elaboration. The phrasing suggested the Spitfire's excellence was simply understood, requiring no detailed explanation among informed pilots. German fighter pilots regarded the Spitfire as their most dangerous opponent, more respected than American fighters and far more capable than Soviet types. This assessment came not from propaganda but from survival calculations, the cold mathematics of who lived and who died when different aircraft met in combat. The story of Circus Rosarius illustrated how seriously Germany took the threat of captured Allied aircraft. Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius was tasked with forming a special unit that collected captured American and British aircraft, tested them thoroughly, and then toured frontline Luftwaffe fighter units to familiarize German pilots with enemy capabilities. The Circus, as it became known, included multiple P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, several Spitfire variants, Mosquitoes, and a Typhoon. Rosarius and his pilots would visit fighter bases, demonstrate the captured aircraft, explain their capabilities and limitations, and sometimes allow German fighter pilots to fly them. The educational value was significant. German pilots who had never seen a P-47 up close, much less flown one, gained appreciation for its strengths and weaknesses. They learned that the massive Thunderbolt was actually quite agile despite its bulk, that it could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying, and that its .850 caliber machine guns delivered frightening firepower. They discovered the P-51 was even faster than intelligence had suggested, with range that allowed it to escort bombers deep into Germany. And they confirmed, through direct experience, that late-model Spitfires outperformed German fighters in most flight regimes. Sometimes frontline pilots were allowed to fly the Circus aircraft. OBER-FW Walter Wolfram, a skilled fighter pilot, tested both P-47s and P-51s. His assessment of the Thunderbolt was unfavorable. I didn't like it. It was too big. The cockpit was immense and unfamiliar, but the P-51 impressed him despite his reluctance to admit it. The Mustang was fast, handled well, had incredible range, and represented exactly the kind of fighter Germany needed, but could not produce in sufficient numbers. The realization that America was building thousands of P-51s while Germany struggled to maintain Bf-109 production was demoralizing. The performance data from Circus Rosarius testing matched what German intelligence had compiled from other sources. The numbers could not be argued with. A Spitfire Mk-14 was faster than any German production fighter. A P-51D had better range than anything Germany flew. The P-47 could outdive anything, absorbing damage that would destroy German aircraft. American and British fighters were not just competitive. They were superior, and the gap was widening as the war progressed. Germany's response was not to develop radically new designs, but to wring incremental improvements from existing fighters while hoping that new jet fighters might change the equation before it was too late. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter represented Germany's best hope for technological leapfrogging past Allied piston engine superiority. In theory, a jet fighter flying 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies had could dominate regardless of other factors. But the Me-262 suffered from reliability problems, short engine life, vulnerability during takeoff and landing, and most critically, insufficient production numbers. Fewer than 1,500 Me-262s were built before war's end, and operational availability rates rarely exceeded 50%. The Me-262 was impressive when it worked, but it did not work often enough or in sufficient numbers to matter strategically. Meanwhile, Spitfire production continued, with over 20,000 built by war's end and 24 major variants plus numerous sub-variants and special-purpose versions. The Spitfire fought in every theater where British forces operated, from the Arctic to the Pacific, from sea level to over 40,000 feet altitude, in roles ranging from photo reconnaissance to fighter bomber to interceptor to carrier-based fighter. This versatility reflected excellent basic design that could be adapted to different missions without requiring complete redesign. German fighters lacked this flexibility, with the Bf-109 and Fw-190 optimized for specific roles that limited their utility in others. The final Spitfire variants, particularly the Mk-14 and later Marks with Griffin engines, represented the culmination of nearly 10 years of continuous development. These aircraft bore little resemblance to the early Mk that Melders had tested in 1940, except for the unmistakable elliptical wings and basic fuselage shape. Everything else had evolved: more powerful engines, Better propellers, improved armament, increased fuel capacity, refined aerodynamics. The Mk-14 carried two 20mm cannons and two 50 caliber machine guns, or alternatively 4 cannons, delivering firepower far beyond what early Spitfires possessed. It could carry bombs or rockets for ground attack missions, extending its utility beyond pure air-to-air combat. Performance figures for the Spitfire Mk-14 made sobering reading for German intelligence analysts. Maximum speed of 444 miles per hour at 20,500 feet. Service ceiling of 43,000 feet. Range of 620 miles on internal fuel, extendable with drop tanks. Climb rate of 4,580 feet per minute. These numbers exceeded what any German production fighter could achieve. The FW-190D9. The best German piston engine fighter to reach operational service in meaningful numbers. Topped out around 425 miles per hour, and could not match the Spitfire's climb rate or service ceiling. The Bf-109K, the final production version of Messerschmitt's famous fighter, achieved about 415 miles per hour maximum speed with the DB605D engine. It could reach 41,000 feet service ceiling and climbed reasonably well, but in direct comparison with the Spitfire Mk-14 it was outmatched. A good German pilot in a 109K could still score kills against Spitfires through tactical cleverness, surprise, or British mistakes, but the fundamental performance advantage had shifted decisively to the British fighter. The equations that determined combat outcomes no longer favored German pilots, and no amount of tactical innovation could fully compensate for inferior aircraft. This represented a complete reversal from 1940, when the Bf-109E had held small but real performance advantages over the early Spitfire. The British had responded to that challenge by developing better versions of their fighter, improving engines, refining systems, fixing weaknesses, while Germany had incrementally updated the Bf-109 without fundamental redesign. The result by 1944 was a British fighter that exceeded German capabilities, while retaining the inherent qualities that had made the original design successful. The Spitfire of 1944 was fast where the 1940 version had been merely quick, powerful where it had been adequate, and sophisticated where it had been simple. German test pilots who flew late were Spitfires understood all this implicitly. The numbers in the test reports did not lie, could not be explained away by pilot skill differences or tactical doctrine variations. A Spitfire Mk-14 flying at 440 miles per hour at 20,000 feet was simply faster than a Bf-109G flying at 400 miles per hour at the same altitude. The British fighter could choose to engage or not, could pursue or evade, while the German pilot could only react to British choices. This was the ultimate tactical advantage, the freedom to dictate engagement terms, and it came from superior performance that no amount of German skill could overcome. The cultural response to these revelations split between realism and denial. Experienced pilots and technical staff acknowledged the performance gap frankly in internal communications, discussing how to minimize disadvantages and exploit any remaining German strengths. But public statements and propaganda maintained the fiction of German superiority, claiming that Luftwaffe fighters remained world-class, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. This disconnect between internal knowledge and public narrative created cognitive dissonance among frontline pilots who knew their aircraft were outmatched but heard propaganda claiming otherwise. Young pilots arriving at fighter units in 1944 and 1945 often learned the truth in the worst possible way during their first combat missions, when British or American fighters demonstrated performance superiority that their training had not prepared them for. Survival rates for new Luftwaffe fighter pilots declined catastrophically in the war's final year, with many pilots shot down during their first few missions before accumulating enough experience to compensate for inferior aircraft. The casualty rates were not just tragic but operationally crippling, creating a death spiral where pilot losses exceeded replacement capacity, forcing even shorter training times, which increased casualty rates further. The industrial context made the situation worse. German aircraft production peaked in 1944 despite Allied bombing, with over 39,000 aircraft built that year. But quality control had declined, spare parts were scarce, and fuel shortages often grounded aircraft that were mechanically sound. The Spitfire, MKXIVs, and P-51Ds that German pilots faced were backed by functioning supply chains, adequate fuel stocks, well-trained maintenance personnel, and replacement aircraft available when needed. German fighters might equal Allied aircraft technically, but they operated within a collapsing logistical system that undermined their effectiveness regardless of design quality. The test reports from Rechlin told a story that Germany's leadership did not want to hear and could not effectively act upon, even if they had wanted to. The Spitfire was faster than German fighters. It climbed better. It turned better. It had better visibility, easier handling, more forgiving characteristics. British pilots received more training, flew more missions before burning out, and operated aircraft that were maintained properly with adequate spare parts. The cumulative effect of all these factors was air superiority that became air dominance. German fighters swept from the skies by opponents they could neither catch nor escape from. The numbers from that final test flight, 444 miles per hour at 20,500 feet, represented more than just Spitfire performance. They quantified the gap between what Britain could produce and what Germany fielded, between the Rolls-Royce Griffon engine's 2,050 horsepower and the Daimler-Benz DB605's 1,475 horsepower, between a design philosophy that prioritized continuous improvement and one that optimized initial performance without adequate development potential. The Spitfire had grown more capable throughout the war, while the Bf-109 had merely grown more desperate. When Werner Mulders died in November 1941, killed in a transport aircraft accident while traveling to attend Ernst Uditz's funeral, he had achieved 115 aerial victories and helped establish German fighter tactics that would be studied for decades. But he never saw how completely his 1940 assessment of the Spitfire would be validated and then exceeded. The fuel cutout weakness he had identified was fixed by 1941. The propeller limitations were corrected. The performance that had merely approached the Bf-109Es in 1940 exceeded the Bf-109Gs by 1,944. Everything Mulders had warned about implicitly in his test report came true. The Spitfire's potential exceeded its initial performance, and that potential would be realized as British engineering improved. The legacy of those test flights at Rechlin was not just technical knowledge, but the uncomfortable realization that Germany had underestimated British aviation capabilities. The assumption that German engineering superiority was inherent and permanent proved false. The belief that resource constraints would prevent Britain from developing competitive fighters proved wrong. The expectation that German tactical doctrine could compensate for small performance disadvantages proved overly optimistic once those disadvantages grew from small to substantial. Every assumption that underpinned German air strategy was challenged by what test pilots learned flying captured Spitfires. The men who flew those test flights, Mulders and Ellen Reeder and the other Rechlin pilots whose names did not make headlines, provided their leadership with accurate information about the threats Germany faced. They documented what the Spitfire could do, predicted how it would improve, and implicitly warned that German fighters needed radical upgrades to remain competitive. But accurate information could not overcome industrial capacity limitations, resource shortages, or strategic decisions made at levels far above test pilot authority. The knowledge gained from flying captured Spitfires changed tactics, but could not change outcomes. By war's end, the Spitfire had compiled an impressive combat record across all theaters, achieving favorable kill ratios against every Axis fighter type. The exact numbers remain disputed because different nations used different counting methods and wartime claims were often inflated. But the overall pattern was clear. Spitfires won more fights than they lost, shot down more aircraft than were shot down, and maintained operational effectiveness from 1940 through 1945. While contemporaries like the Bf-109 declined from competitive to outmatched, this longevity reflected design excellence that allowed continuous development, each variant addressing previous limitations while maintaining the qualities that made the original successful. The 444 miles per hour that late-model Spitfires achieved represented the physical manifestation of British industrial and engineering capability. It was not just a number, but a measurement of horsepower applied efficiently, of aerodynamics refined through years of incremental improvement, of manufacturing quality that kept tolerances tight enough to achieve design performance. German test pilots who flew late-war Spitfires understood they were not just testing an aircraft, but confronting evidence of how completely the technological balance had shifted. The fighter that Mulders had called miserable in 1940 had evolved into something Germany could not match by 1944, and that evolution had been steady, systematic, and apparently unstoppable. The final irony was that the Spitfire's most serious competition came not from German fighters but from other Allied designs. The P-51 Mustang matched or exceeded late Spitfire performance in some regimes while offering vastly superior range. The P-47 Thunderbolt could not match the Spitfire's elegance but delivered rugged reliability and firepower that made it equally effective in many roles. American and British fighters competed with each other for supremacy, while German fighters competed merely to survive encounters with either. The conversation among Allied pilots about which fighter was better was a luxury that Luftwaffe pilots could not share, having no competitive German fighter to advocate for. When Rechlin was captured by Soviet forces in May 1945, They found wrecked aircraft scattered across the airfields, hasty destruction having been incomplete. Among the debris were remains of captured Allied aircraft that had been tested there, including at least one Spitfire variant that had been damaged beyond repair and abandoned. The intelligence value was gone by then, the war over, but the aircraft remained as physical evidence of what Germany had learned and failed to act upon. Soviet engineers examined the wrecks with interest, taking measurements and notes that would inform their own post-war fighter development. The knowledge flow that had moved from British designs through German testing to Soviet analysis completed a strange circle of technology transfer enabled by combat. The test pilots who had flown those captured Spitfires mostly survived the war, their skills valuable enough that they were kept away from frontline combat once their test work became known. They went on to various post-war careers, some continuing in aviation, others moving to different fields, but all carrying memories of what it felt like to fly both sides of the air war. They had flown Bf-109s and FW-190s and German markings and Spitfires and British roundels, covered by German crosses, and they knew better than anyone how the performance compared. The numbers in their test reports were not propaganda or estimate, but measured fact. And those facts told a story of German inadequacy that could not be admitted publicly, but could not be denied privately. 444 miles per hour at 20,500 feet. That number stayed with the surviving test pilots, a quantification of how completely British aviation had exceeded German capabilities by war's end. It was faster than anything Germany produced in quantity, faster than most of what Germany experimented with, and achieved by an aircraft design that had first flown in 1936. The Spitfire was not revolutionary in concept, not dependent on exotic technologies or materials, just exceptionally well designed and continuously improved. That was perhaps the most sobering lesson from all of the test flights. British aviation did not need revolutionary breakthroughs to exceed German capabilities, just competent engineering consistently applied. The legacy of those test flights extends beyond the immediate tactical and strategic lessons. They demonstrated the importance of objective evaluation, even when results contradict comfortable narratives. Mulders could have written a more positive assessment of the Spitfire, emphasizing its weaknesses while minimizing its strengths, giving his superiors the reassuring evaluation they wanted to hear. Instead, he wrote accurately, documenting both strengths and weaknesses, providing information that pilots needed to survive even though it complicated the story of German superiority. That intellectual honesty, maintained despite political pressure to do otherwise, represented professionalism at its best. For historians examining the air war over Europe, the test flights at Rechlin provide rare ground truth data uncorrupted by combat claims or propaganda. When German test pilots reported that late Spitfires outperformed German fighters, that assessment carried weight precisely because it contradicted German interests to admit it. The reports exist in archives, dry technical documents filled with performance curves and handling notes. But between the numbers lies acknowledgement of defeat, recognition that Germany faced opponents building better aircraft with greater industrial capacity and no realistic hope of catching up. The test pilots wrote those acknowledgments without explicitly stating them, letting the numbers speak for themselves because numbers could not be argued with or wished away. The story of German pilots flying captured Spitfires is ultimately about the collision between mythology and reality, between what propaganda claimed and what physics measured. The mythology said German engineering was superior, that Luftwaffe fighters were world-class, that tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantages. The reality, documented in test flight reports and combat casualty statistics, told a different story. British fighters were better, German pilots knew they were better, and the 444 miles per hour that Spitfire MKXIVs achieved was the number that made that undeniable. It was not just speed, but vindication of British design philosophy, validation of continuous improvement over revolutionary innovation, and condemnation of German assumptions about inherent technical superiority. The numbers don't lie, even when narratives do. The test pilots at Rechlin documented a truth that Germany's leadership couldn't acknowledge. By 1944, the Spitfire was simply better. 444 miles per hour wasn't just a speed. It was the measurement of how completely the technological balance had shifted. If this deep dive into aviation history revealed truths you'd never heard before, hit that subscribe button. History is written not in propaganda but in the test reports where pilots wrote what they really discovered when they flew the enemy's best fighter, and had to admit it exceeded their own. Thank you for listening to this untold chapter of the air war over Europe.